Sometimes the greatest miracle in a person's life begins the moment someone chooses to see their heart instead of their circumstances. A cold January wind swept through the aging streets on the south side of Chicago, carrying tiny snowflakes across weathered brick buildings that had survived generations of hardship without losing their quiet spirit. To most people driving past, the neighborhood looked forgotten, another place marked for demolition by investors searching for profitable opportunities. To Naomi Brooks, it was the only home she had ever known and the place that had taught her the true meaning of resilience. At 24 years old, Naomi had grown up surrounded by people who possessed very little, yet somehow found ways to share everything they had. Every morning before sunrise, she unlocked the small community center that stood between two aging apartment buildings, arranging donated books, preparing warm breakfasts for neighborhood children, and checking on elderly residents who struggled through Chicago's harsh winters alone. She never considered herself extraordinary because kindness had become as natural to her as breathing. Her late grandmother often reminded her that a person's greatest wealth was the ability to leave someone else's day better than they found it. And Naomi quietly lived by those words every single day. Several miles away, Alexander Hayes stood inside the executive office of Hayes International on the 70th floor overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking skyline covered in fresh snow, while rows of financial reports rested neatly across a polished walnut desk. At 37 years old, Alexander had become one of the youngest billionaire chief executive officers in the country, admired by shareholders for his discipline and respected by competitors for his extraordinary business instincts. Every decision he made affected thousands of employees and billions of dollars in investments, yet success had gradually filled his calendar while leaving very little room for genuine human connection. His grandfather's silver pocket watch rested beside redevelopment blueprints scheduled for final approval later that week. According to every consultant and financial analyst, transforming the South Side neighborhood into luxury residences would become one of the company's most profitable projects. The numbers were impressive. The forecasts were undeniable. Yet something inside Alexander resisted signing the final authorization before seeing the neighborhood himself. Later that afternoon, his driver guided the company's sedan through streets Alexander had previously known only through reports and architectural drawings. Instead of abandoned hopelessness, he noticed families clearing snow from sidewalks together, children laughing despite the freezing weather, and neighbors greeting one another with sincere warmth. As traffic slowed near a small intersection, his attention settled on a young woman wearing a modest navy coat and knitted scarf. Naomi carefully helped an elderly man carry heavy grocery bags across an icy crosswalk before kneeling to zip a little boy's winter jacket that had come undone in the cold wind. She accepted neither money nor praise, smiling warmly before continuing toward the community center with quiet confidence. Alexander watched the simple scene in complete silence. No cameras followed her. No reporters recorded the moment. She was simply doing what she believed was right without expecting recognition. Something about her peaceful strength unsettled the assumptions he had built over decades of board meetings and financial success. He had spent years believing remarkable people announce themselves through influence, prestige, and achievement. Yet the young woman disappearing into the snowy neighborhood possessed a quiet dignity more powerful than any title he had ever earned. As the traffic light changed and the car slowly pulled away, Alexander continued looking through the rear window long after she had vanished from sight, unaware that the brief encounter had already begun changing the direction of his life in ways neither wealth nor power could ever have predicted. The image of the young woman standing in the falling snow remained with Alexander Hayes long after he returned to the towering headquarters of Hayes International. The following morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive boardroom as directors, attorneys, and senior advisors gathered around the polished walnut table to review the final redevelopment proposal. Charts projected impressive financial growth, architects presented elegant designs for luxury condominiums, and investors praised the opportunity to transform an overlooked neighborhood into one of Chicago's most profitable districts. Every presentation celebrated numbers, market value, and shareholder confidence. Yet as Alexander quietly studied the documents before him, he realized something important was missing. None of the reports mentioned the names of the families who had built their lives there. None described the elderly neighbors who depended on one another through difficult winters or the children whose happiest memories belonged to streets that accountants viewed only as valuable real estate. Instead of approving the proposal, Alexander calmly closed the presentation folder and surprised everyone in the room. He announced that no final decision would be made until he had personally spoken with representatives from the community. Several directors exchanged uncertain glances, believing the meeting would simply delay an inevitable outcome, but Alexander remained firm. Later that afternoon, his chief legal advisor contacted the Neighborhood Learning Center and respectfully requested a meeting with Naomi Brooks. When the invitation reached her, many volunteers encouraged her to decline, convinced that another corporate executive only wanted to justify decisions already made. Naomi listened carefully before smiling with quiet confidence. She believed that refusing to speak guaranteed no one would ever be heard, while honest conversation always carried the possibility of change. The next morning, she boarded a city train carrying only a small leather notebook filled with handwritten ideas collected from residents over many years. She wore a neatly pressed navy blazer, simple dark slacks, practical shoes, and the same calm expression that had never changed regardless of where life placed her. Upon arriving at Hayes International, she stepped into a magnificent marble lobby where towering glass walls reflected the winter skyline, and employees hurried through the building with briefcases and electronic tablets. Curious eyes briefly settled upon the young woman from a neighborhood many executives knew only through financial reports, but Naomi greeted everyone with quiet courtesy and continued walking without hesitation. Moments later, the executive elevator opened and Alexander stepped into the lobby. For a brief second, they simply recognized one another from the snowy intersection where their paths had first crossed. Alexander approached with genuine respect and extended his hand. "Miss Brooks, thank you for accepting my invitation." Naomi returned the handshake with steady confidence and a warm smile. "Thank you for deciding to meet the people behind the paperwork, Mr. Hayes." Together they entered the executive conference room overlooking the Chicago River, where steaming coffee rested beside neatly organized redevelopment plans. Alexander expected a passionate protest against the project, yet Naomi surprised him once again. Instead of beginning with criticism, she opened her notebook and quietly placed several hand-drawn maps on the table, each marked with schools, family businesses, churches, community gardens, and homes that represented decades of shared history. Looking directly into Alexander's eyes, she spoke with gentle sincerity. "Buildings can always be replaced. A community can only be rebuilt if the people who created it are allowed to remain part of its future." As silence settled across the conference room, Alexander realized this meeting was no longer about approving a construction project. It had become the beginning of a conversation capable of changing both of their lives forever. The conversation that began with redevelopment plans continued for nearly 3 hours. Yet neither Alexander Hayes nor Naomi Brooks noticed how quickly the afternoon disappeared beyond the glass walls overlooking the Chicago River. Instead of debating statistics, they spoke about people. Naomi carefully explained how every street inside the neighborhood carried memories that could never appear inside financial projections. She described the retired schoolteacher who organized free reading sessions every Saturday morning, the family-owned bakery that quietly delivered bread to elderly neighbors during snowstorms, and the community garden where children learned responsibility by growing vegetables alongside grandparents who had lived there for decades. Alexander listened without interruption, making occasional notes in the margin of his proposal rather than challenging her perspective. For the first time in years, a business meeting felt less like a negotiation and more like an education. Before Naomi left that afternoon, Alexander surprised both of them with an unexpected request. "Would you allow me to see the neighborhood the way you see it?" Naomi studied him for a brief moment before answering. "If you are willing to walk instead of simply observe, I will gladly show you." 2 days later, Alexander arrived without a convoy of luxury vehicles or a team of executives following behind him. Wearing a simple charcoal coat over a dark sweater instead of an expensive tailored suit, he met Naomi outside the community learning center just after sunrise. Fresh snow covered the sidewalks while neighborhood shop owners swept their storefronts before opening for the day. As they walked together, Alexander quickly realized something remarkable. Nearly everyone greeted Naomi by name. Children ran toward her with excited smiles, elderly residents waved from apartment windows, and local business owners stopped to thank her for countless acts of kindness she had never mentioned during their meeting. She introduced Alexander simply as a friend who wanted to learn, never mentioning that he controlled one of the largest companies in the country. They visited the small bakery where warm cinnamon rolls filled the air with comforting sweetness, a neighborhood barber who had offered free haircuts to children before every school year for decades, and the tiny public library where volunteers patiently repaired worn books instead of replacing them because many carried handwritten notes from generations of local families. Everywhere Alexander looked, he discovered people quietly caring for one another without expecting recognition. Later that afternoon they arrived at the Community Learning Center, where volunteers prepared winter coats, school supplies, and hot meals for families facing difficult times. Without being asked, Alexander helped carry heavy donation boxes, arranged folding tables, and organized stacks of books alongside everyone else. When a young boy accidentally dropped an entire container of colored pencils across the classroom floor, Alexander immediately knelt beside him, helping gather every pencil while the child laughed with relief instead of embarrassment. Naomi noticed the moment from across the room and smiled quietly. She recognized that his kindness had not been performed for appearances because no cameras, reporters, or shareholders were watching. As evening settled over Chicago, they locked the learning center together before beginning the short walk back toward the train station. Warm lights glowed from apartment windows while snowflakes drifted gently beneath the street lamps. Alexander finally broke the comfortable silence between them. "I spent years believing leadership meant making difficult financial decisions," he admitted thoughtfully. "Today I realized leadership may begin by listening before deciding." Naomi looked toward him with quiet admiration. "People rarely expect someone with great influence to ask sincere questions," she replied softly. "That is why the answers matter so much when they finally do." Alexander carried those words with him long after they said goodnight. Without either of them fully realizing it, the distance between two completely different worlds had already begun to disappear, replaced by a growing respect that neither wealth nor hardship could ever have created alone. During the weeks that followed, an unexpected routine quietly reshaped both of their lives. Every weekday morning Alexander fulfilled his responsibilities inside the towering headquarters of Hayes International, negotiating acquisitions, reviewing contracts, and leading executive meetings that influenced markets across the country. Yet as the afternoon faded into evening, his thoughts increasingly returned to the South Side neighborhood, where life followed an entirely different rhythm. He found himself looking forward to conversations that never appeared on his calendar. One Friday afternoon he arrived at the Community Learning Center carrying several large boxes of donated computers that his technology division had recently replaced. Instead of making a public announcement, he helped volunteers carefully carry each box inside before joining children as they assembled desks and arranged bookshelves for a new study room. Naomi thanked him with the same quiet warmth she offered every volunteer, never treating him differently because of his wealth or position. That simple equality became one of the greatest gifts anyone had ever offered him. A few days later Naomi accepted Alexander's invitation to visit Hayes International again, not for another formal meeting, but to better understand the responsibilities that shaped every decision he made. She toured the engineering department, greeted receptionists by name after being introduced only once, and listened attentively as project managers explained the complexity of balancing employee welfare, investor expectations, and long-term planning. Rather than becoming intimidated by the scale of the company, she asked thoughtful questions about apprenticeship programs, affordable housing partnerships, and educational opportunities for local residents. Senior executives who had initially expected an uncomfortable visitor soon discovered themselves engaged in meaningful conversations about sustainable growth and community investment. Even the company's longest-serving employees quietly admitted that the atmosphere inside the building felt noticeably different whenever Naomi visited. One evening Alexander invited Naomi to a formal charity dinner attended by civic leaders, business executives, and philanthropists from across Chicago. Before the event began, he gently explained the customs and etiquette expected during official receptions, not because he wished to change who she was, but because he wanted her to feel completely comfortable in any room she entered. Naomi listened with genuine curiosity, learning every detail with calm confidence while never pretending to be someone she was not. Throughout the evening, she spoke naturally with guests from every background, asking sincere questions instead of trying to impress anyone. By the end of the reception, several influential donors expressed admiration for her thoughtful perspective on community development, and Alexander watched with quiet pride as people respected her because of her character rather than her circumstances. During the drive back through the illuminated streets of Chicago, neither of them spoke for several minutes. Snowflakes drifted gently beyond the windows, while the city lights reflected across the river in shimmering ribbons of gold. Alexander finally smiled to himself before saying softly, "I thought I was teaching you how to navigate my world." Naomi turned toward him with a gentle expression. "And instead?" she asked. Alexander looked out across the skyline before answering with complete honesty. "Instead, you have been teaching me how to become worthy of it." Naomi lowered her eyes with a humble smile, saying nothing more because some moments became more meaningful when left undisturbed by unnecessary words. As the car continued through the quiet winter night, both of them sensed that something profound had changed. They were no longer simply a billionaire and a young woman from different worlds trying to understand one another. Without speaking about love, they had already become the safest place either of them had ever known. As February quietly settled over Chicago, the relationship between Alexander Hayes and Naomi Brooks continued to deepen in ways neither of them had anticipated. Nothing about their growing connection felt rushed or dramatic. Instead, it unfolded through ordinary moments that slowly became the most meaningful parts of their days. Alexander no longer viewed his visits to the community as interruptions to his demanding schedule. They had become the place where the constant pressure of board meetings, shareholder expectations, and financial negotiations quietly disappeared. One Saturday morning, Naomi invited him to the neighborhood Winter Appreciation Festival, an annual gathering organized entirely by volunteers to celebrate the people who had supported one another through another difficult season. Instead of arriving with photographers or company representatives, Alexander drove himself in a modest sedan, wearing a simple charcoal coat and dark sweater. The children greeted him with excitement rather than formality, asking him to help decorate the community hall with handmade paper snowflakes and strings of white lights. Without hesitation, he climbed a ladder to hang decorations while parents prepared homemade meals and elderly neighbors shared stories that filled the room with laughter. Naomi watched from across the hall as Alexander patiently listened to every conversation, smiling with a sincerity she had never seen inside the executive boardroom. Later that afternoon, a local music teacher invited several children to perform a small concert using donated instruments. When one young girl became too nervous to play her violin before the audience, Naomi gently encouraged her while Alexander quietly moved to the front row and applauded before the performance had even begun. His simple gesture eased the child's fear, and soon the room filled with beautiful music followed by heartfelt applause. Naomi noticed how naturally he inspired confidence without realizing it. After the celebration ended, they walked together through the peaceful neighborhood beneath rows of glowing streetlights, while fresh snow covered the sidewalks in soft white layers. The sounds of distant laughter gradually faded behind them until only the quiet rhythm of their footsteps remained. Alexander finally broke the silence. "When I first came here, I thought I was searching for answers about a redevelopment project," he admitted thoughtfully. "Now I realize I was searching for a part of myself I had forgotten." Naomi smiled gently as she looked toward the softly illuminated windows of nearby homes. "Sometimes life allows us to discover who we really are only after we stop trying to become who everyone expects us to be," she replied. Her words lingered in the cold evening air, carrying more comfort than any reassurance Alexander had ever received. During the following weeks, they continued working side by side, reviewing updated redevelopment plans that now included affordable housing protections, expanded educational programs, neighborhood business grants, and permanent community spaces designed according to suggestions gathered directly from local families. Every improvement represented another conversation they had shared and another lesson they had learned together. The executives at Hayes International gradually noticed a remarkable change in Alexander's leadership. Meetings that once focused exclusively on quarterly performance now included discussions about long-term community impact and employee well-being. Investors initially questioned the revised direction, yet many soon recognized that trust and responsibility could strengthen a company just as effectively as financial efficiency. One quiet evening, after reviewing the final proposal together inside the learning center, Alexander and Naomi stood beside the window watching gentle snowflakes fall across the empty playground. Neither of them spoke about love because neither believed it needed grand declarations. The understanding reflected in their eyes had already become stronger than words. Without making promises, they had quietly become each other's greatest source of encouragement. And although neither realized it yet, that quiet bond was about to face the greatest challenge either of them had ever known. The peaceful routine that Alexander Hayes and Naomi Brooks had built together was tested sooner than either of them expected. Early one Monday morning, as the executive board assembled inside the headquarters of Hayes International, several influential shareholders arrived with expressions far more serious than usual. Financial news outlets had begun publishing anonymous articles questioning why the redevelopment project had changed so dramatically. Although no article directly accused Naomi of wrongdoing, each carefully suggested that Alexander's judgment had become clouded by his growing friendship with a young community leader who possessed no corporate experience. Within hours, the speculation spread across business networks, social media platforms, and investment forums. Reporters waited outside the company's headquarters hoping to capture reactions that would fuel another day's headlines. Alexander remained calm throughout every interview request, declining to respond before understanding the source of the allegations. Inside the neighborhood learning center, however, Naomi experienced the consequences immediately. Several concerned volunteers showed her the articles on their phones, worried that public pressure might force Hayes International to abandon the redevelopment plan entirely. Naomi quietly thanked them for their concern before returning to her usual routine of organizing donated books, preparing lunches for children, and visiting elderly residents. She refused to allow rumors to change the way she treated the people who depended upon her every day. That evening, Alexander drove to the community center after finishing an exhausting series of emergency meetings with investors and attorneys. He found Naomi placing fresh flowers beside a memorial photograph of her grandmother before locking the building for the night. They walked together beneath the soft glow of streetlights, while a gentle breeze carried the first signs of approaching spring through the neighborhood. Alexander finally spoke with quiet regret. "I never wanted my world to place this burden upon your shoulders." Naomi looked at him with the same calm kindness that had always steadied his thoughts. "People often believe rumors because they are easier to repeat than the truth," she answered softly. "The truth does not need to race. It only needs time." Her peaceful confidence offered more comfort than any legal strategy his advisors had proposed throughout the day. Meanwhile, inside Hayes International, several senior board members privately encouraged Alexander to distance himself from Naomi until public attention faded. They argued that shareholders valued stability above personal loyalty and warned that continuing to defend the revised redevelopment proposal might weaken investor confidence. Alexander listened respectfully before closing the meeting with a simple statement that surprised everyone in the room. A company built upon integrity cannot abandon integrity when it becomes inconvenient. After everyone left, he instructed his chief legal officer to commission an independent forensic investigation into every internal communication related to the redevelopment project, determined to uncover exactly who had initiated the coordinated campaign of misinformation. He wanted facts instead of assumptions, evidence instead of speculation. Late that night, standing alone beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago, Alexander reflected upon the remarkable journey that had begun with a single act of kindness at a snowy crosswalk. Success had once meant protecting quarterly profits above everything else. Now he understood that leadership demanded something greater. If protecting an honest person required risking criticism, temporary uncertainty, or even his own reputation, then those sacrifices would be worth making. Unaware that the investigation had already begun, Naomi returned home believing only that tomorrow she would once again unlock the community center before sunrise, greet every child with the same warm smile, and continue living according to the principles that no rumor could ever diminish. Neither of them realized that the truth was already moving quietly toward the light, preparing to reveal not only who had orchestrated the deception, but also how deeply their lives had become connected through trust, courage, and unwavering respect. Nearly 3 weeks after the independent investigation quietly began, the first confidential report arrived on Alexander Hayes's desk before sunrise. The thick folder contained hundreds of pages of verified communications, financial records, and digital correspondence carefully reviewed by outside forensic specialists who had no connection to Hayes International or its board of directors. Alexander remained alone inside his office as the city slowly awakened beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Page after page revealed the same disturbing pattern. Anonymous articles questioning Naomi Brooks had never been written by independent journalists. They had originated through a consulting firm secretly hired by one influential shareholder determined to force the redevelopment project back to its original design. Fabricated narratives had been strategically released to create doubt, weaken public confidence, and pressure Alexander into abandoning the community-centered plan. The investigation confirmed what Alexander had quietly believed from the beginning. Naomi had never requested personal favors, financial benefits, or special treatment. Every recommendation she had offered had been documented months before any rumors appeared and had always focused on protecting families, preserving local businesses, and creating opportunities for future generations. Alexander slowly closed the report and rested his hand upon his grandfather's silver pocket watch. Years earlier, his grandfather had once told him that leadership was measured most clearly when truth became expensive. For the first time, Alexander fully understood those words. Rather than calling a press conference immediately, he instructed the legal department to verify every finding one final time and prepare formal documentation that could withstand any public scrutiny. He wanted the truth to be unquestionable before presenting it to the board, investors, and the city. That afternoon, he drove to the neighborhood learning center carrying nothing except the sealed investigation summary. Inside, Naomi was helping several children paint colorful spring murals celebrating hope and new beginnings. Laughter echoed through the room as volunteers organized books and prepared after-school snacks. Watching her from the doorway, Alexander realized that despite weeks of unfair attention, she had never allowed disappointment to change the way she served others. When the children returned home, they walked together through the nearby community garden, where the first green leaves of spring had begun replacing the final traces of winter. Alexander handed her the sealed report. Naomi quietly read the executive summary before closing the folder without turning another page. "You are not surprised?" Alexander asked gently. She smiled with peaceful confidence. "Truth has always been patient," she replied. "It never needs to hurry because it always arrives at the right moment." Alexander looked at her with quiet admiration. Most people would feel angry after everything that happened. Naomi shook her head softly. "If I allow bitterness to become part of my heart, then the rumors would take something far more valuable than my reputation." Her answer settled into the afternoon silence with remarkable grace. Standing beneath the budding trees, Alexander finally understood what had been changing inside him for months. It was never simply admiration. It was never only gratitude. Somewhere between shared conversations, ordinary acts of kindness, and countless quiet moments, Naomi had become the person whose opinion mattered more than applause from investors or praise from the business world. Looking directly into her eyes, he spoke with complete honesty. "Before I met you, I believed success was something a person achieved alone. Now I know the greatest success is becoming someone worthy of another person's trust." Naomi's gentle smile answered before words ever could. At that moment, Alexander made one final decision with absolute certainty. During the upcoming shareholders' assembly, he would reveal every verified fact, defend Naomi publicly without hesitation, and stand beside her regardless of the personal or professional cost. Because some decisions shaped a career, but others defined an entire life. The annual shareholders' assembly opened beneath towering crystal chandeliers inside the grand conference hall of Hayes International, where influential investors, board members, legal advisors, financial analysts, and civic leaders gathered to witness the most important vote in the company's history. Spring sunlight poured through the enormous glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago, reflecting across polished marble floors and creating an atmosphere of quiet anticipation. Every seat had been filled long before the meeting officially began. Reporters waited near the entrance while cameras prepared to document the decisions that would shape both the redevelopment project and the future of one of America's most respected companies. Alexander Hayes entered the room wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. Yet the confidence in his expression no longer came from wealth or authority. Came from certainty. During the weeks leading to the meeting, he had reviewed every page of the independent investigation until every fact had been confirmed beyond question. He no longer feared criticism because he knew the truth required neither permission nor popularity. As the formal presentations concluded, Alexander walked calmly toward the podium carrying only a single leather folder containing the verified investigation. The room became completely silent. Instead of beginning with financial forecasts or investment projections, he spoke slowly and clearly. A company's reputation is not protected by hiding the truth. It is protected by having the courage to reveal it. His words echoed through the hall before he carefully presented the complete findings of the forensic investigation. Every document demonstrated how false narratives had been deliberately created by an outside consulting firm working with one influential shareholder determined to restore the original redevelopment proposal. Independent legal specialists, compliance auditors, and digital investigators had all reached the same conclusion. Naomi Brooks had never requested personal benefits, financial favors, or preferential treatment. Every recommendation she offered had always focused on protecting families, preserving local businesses, expanding educational opportunities, and strengthening the future of the neighborhood. The evidence was detailed, transparent, and impossible to dispute. Quiet conversations spread throughout the audience as shareholders examined the documents displayed on the presentation screens. Several directors lowered their eyes while others exchanged thoughtful expressions, recognizing that assumptions had nearly replaced fairness. Alexander allowed the silence to settle before continuing. Today, I would like everyone here to meet the person whose integrity challenged me to become a better leader. He turned toward the entrance, where Naomi quietly entered wearing an elegant but modest navy dress beneath a light spring coat. She walked through the ballroom with calm dignity, greeting every person she passed with the same gentle courtesy she had always shown regardless of status or influence. Alexander welcomed her to the stage, then faced the audience once more. This remarkable woman never asked me to change a single decision for her own benefit. She simply reminded me that every business decision ultimately affects human lives. She taught me that responsibility begins with listening before leading. For several moments the hall remained completely still. Then one elderly shareholder slowly stood and began applauding. Another investor followed, then another, until the entire audience rose together in a sincere standing ovation. The applause celebrated neither victory nor defeat. It honored truth, humility, compassion, and unwavering character. Alexander looked toward Naomi, and she returned his gaze with the same peaceful smile that had first captured his attention on a snowy Chicago afternoon. Standing beside her before the entire business community, he understood that protecting her dignity had become the proudest decision of his career, because lasting success would never be measured by the height of a skyline, but by the strength of the values that guided the people courageous enough to build it together. Several months passed, and the first warm days of spring transformed the south side of Chicago into a place almost unrecognizable from the neighborhood Alexander Hayes had first visited. Restored brick buildings stood proudly beside newly planted trees. Local cafes welcomed familiar faces each morning. Children filled the renovated playground with laughter. And the community learning center had become a symbol of hope for families who once feared losing everything they loved. The redevelopment project that many investors had doubted soon became a national example of responsible leadership, proving that lasting prosperity could be achieved without sacrificing the people who had given a neighborhood its soul. Alexander visited the community almost every weekend, not as the chief executive officer inspecting another investment but as a neighbor who genuinely belonged there. He helped organize literacy programs, joined volunteers repainting classrooms, and quietly shared conversations with longtime residents who no longer saw him as a billionaire, but simply as Alexander. Naomi continued leading the community center with the same humility that had inspired everyone from the very beginning. Success never changed her gentle spirit because she had never measured her worth through recognition. One beautiful evening, as the entire neighborhood gathered to celebrate the official completion of the redevelopment, strings of warm lights stretched across the restored square, while musicians played familiar songs and families shared homemade meals beneath blooming trees. Children who had once studied in temporary classrooms now proudly welcomed visitors into their new library. Elderly neighbors smiled as they watched another generation inherit the community they had fought to preserve. Standing beside Naomi, Alexander quietly reflected on how every meaningful change in his life had begun with one ordinary act of kindness at a snowy intersection months earlier. When the mayor concluded a brief speech honoring the residents, Alexander stepped forward holding a small velvet box. The conversations around the square gradually faded into silence. Looking directly into Naomi's eyes, he spoke with complete sincerity. People often believe that I changed your future because I had wealth and influence. The truth is exactly the opposite. You reminded me that compassion is stronger than power, that listening is greater than commanding, and that the greatest success any person can achieve is earning another person's trust. Before I met you, I built successful companies. After I met you, I finally learned how to build a meaningful life. He opened the velvet box, revealing a simple platinum ring whose quiet elegance reflected everything they had built together. Naomi Brooks, you never asked me to become someone different. You simply inspired me to become the best version of the man I was always capable of being. Will you honor me by walking beside me for the rest of our lives? Tears of quiet happiness filled Naomi's eyes as she smiled with the same warmth that had first captured his heart. Yes, she whispered, and the single word carried more meaning than every business victory Alexander had ever celebrated. Gentle applause slowly grew into joyful cheers as neighbors, volunteers, employees, civic leaders, and children surrounded them with genuine happiness. A few weeks later, they exchanged vows beneath the old oak tree beside the community learning center, choosing the neighborhood that had brought them together instead of a grand ballroom. There were no barriers separating wealth from hardship, only families, friends, and grateful neighbors celebrating two people whose lives had forever changed one another through kindness, respect, and unwavering integrity. Years later, visitors admired the neighborhood as one of Chicago's greatest renewal stories. But those who truly understood its history always remembered something far more important. A remarkable community had flourished because one compassionate woman refused to let hardship define her future. And one determined man discovered that the richest legacy anyone could leave behind would never be measured by fortune alone, but by the lives transformed through dignity, hope, generosity, and love.